I believe this crisis, this war, is located in the centuries of domination of the world by the European colonial countries and the later American hegemon. And it's that which is being put to the test in the conflict in Ukraine. It's not just about Ukraine. It's about whether those centuries of domination are coming to an end. And sing hallelujah, the tectonic plates have very clearly shifted, and that domination of the earth by the imperialist club, now known as NATO, is in front of our eyes coming to an end. A new multipolar world is being born. This is visible not just on the battlefield, not just on the inability of the colonialist club to prevail on the battlefield. If you think about it, Russia is actually fighting all these NATO powers. And there's now an acknowledgement, even in the New York Times, that they cannot prevail, but it's being demonstrated on the economic battlefield too, perhaps more significantly. Just a year ago, they were going to reduce the ruble to rubble. You remember that? And the ruble was the strongest performing currency of 2022. Just a year ago, Russia was going to implode. It was isolated. The world had isolated it. You see the arrogance of the language of this colonialist club. They're the world, you know, even though they actually represent only 13% of the entire population of the world. And there are many of us in that 13% who say no to NATO, no to colonialism, no to hegemonism. Many of us, many millions of us, even in this country where you would have thought we would be lagging. We could have sold out this hall 10 times. 10 times. We've already sold it out 3 times, which is why I better hurry up. We could have sold it out 10 times. Even though there's another less clear event taking place in London at the same time. But in countries like France, like Germany, like Slovakia, and many other places, there are even more millions of people, as all polling shows, as protests and demonstrations show, as the political crises in Germany shows. Who'd put money on Schultz still being Chancellor of Germany at this time next year? Not many. When it's revealed, not only is he doing nothing about one of the greatest terrorist crimes of the century, perhaps the most significant terrorist crime of the century. Sure, thousands of people weren't murdered like they were in New York, but Europe and its economy has been murdered by that crime. Yes. Not only did he do nothing about it, Jacques Hughes, or whatever the German is, I say Schultz knew that that pipeline was going to be blown up, and I'm confident that that will be revealed by Seymour Hersh and other people that are on the track. My last word for now, because it's my lateness that's caused this delay. I've been looking into the Monroe Doctrine. Yeah. Call me perverse. I just wanted to see, because I've never known, I've spoken about the Monroe Doctrine in passing 1,000 times, but I never actually studied what it was about. This one is particularly for the New York Times. I'm not singling you out, you're very welcome here. Your boss, not so much, but you are fine. The Monroe Doctrine was the enunciation by the United States of America that it would not tolerate European interference in the Americas. Well, I say we need a European Monroe Doctrine. We need to say, America, we love you. Americans, we love you. But we will not be your vassal states. We will not be pushed into war and potential nuclear war by you. And we will not allow you to destroy our economies. All of this is a prelude to inviting to speak one of the finest Americans, a good friend of mine and of ours, a man whose writings and whose speeches and whose activism has done so much to show the people of the world that just as Britain is not Rashid Sunak, neither is America Joe Biden. A great American who's come all the way from the United States to address us, Dan Kovalik. Welcome to London and welcome to NO2NATO.
Gotta get me.
Audrey.
Thank you so much. I am very honored to be here, and I did fly here from the United States. I actually just say, I teach international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, and I would not miss this event for a few reasons. I mean, first and foremost is this poster, very correctly documents we are facing possible nuclear annihilation. What more important
Nick Brana's coming down.
issue could one stand up for at this time? In fact, I think there will be people many years from now who will judge themselves and others based on what positions they took at this time and whether they stood against their own governments in trying to prevent nuclear war. And I'm proud to stand with all of you. Of course, another reason I'm here is because of that man, George Galloway, who in 2003, and I still watch this video for inspiration time and again, when you eviscerated the Senate.
Thank you. Thank you.
And just as you told the Senate then, we could say to our own governments now, you are wrong and we are right.
Yeah.
And we have the truth and rightness on our side. By the way, I have this book for you, and I have a simple inscription for you, George. It says simply, to George, you are a true hero. Solidarity. I think it's very fitting, by the way, I see some signs up there, and I appreciate them. Free Julian Assange, and I echo that sentiment. And I think it's very telling, and I think we should all meditate on this. How just as Julian Assange had to find asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy, we had to find asylum at the Venezuelan Cultural Center. And I want to thank the government of Venezuela for allowing us to be here. And despite the fact that our countries, the United States and Great Britain, try to tell the world how to be democratic and how to have free speech and free rights, we have to go to a Venezuelan building to hold this event. Because no one else would house us. Not even buildings, as I was told before here, that used to house heretics and protect them, and they will not house us. Despite the fact that what we're saying is true. But of course, as Dostoevsky wrote many years ago, it's easier to forgive someone for being wrong than to forgive them for being right.
Very good.
And we are right. A lot of people will criticize us, and do, in fact, every single day, for being Russian apologists. And they will tell us, why aren't you criticizing Russia instead of criticizing your own government? And I go back to Noam Chomsky, and he has written several times about what he calls the responsibility of intellectuals. And in these writings, he cites the biblical prophets. And he points out that the biblical prophets, their job was to criticize their own governments, to criticize their own emperors and their own pharaohs. And of course, they were maligned and ridiculed and even killed for doing so. But that is our duty. That is the essence of morality. Not to look upon the sins of others, but to look at our own sins and our own nation's sins. But it's also a practical issue. We don't vote in Russia. We can't vote Putin in. We can't vote him out. We can only vote in our own countries, in Great Britain and for me in the United States. So we have some ability to hold our own governments accountable. So it only makes sense that that's where we focus our critiques. That's where we focus our protests, because it's the only place we could actually do some good. And that's why I'm here today. And of course, I echo George's view that it is time, as I see it, and I humbly say this to you, people of Great Britain, it is time that Europe reject United States domination. My country is leading Europe over the precipice. And you mentioned the Nord Stream 2 terrorist attack, and that's what it was. We all knew who did it even before Seymour Hersh told us. But now we know from Seymour Hersh that the United States did it with some help from others, including Norway, probably others, as you say, probably with the tacit agreement of many other countries. But when you talk about NATO, NATO's an alliance. What kind of an alliance allows one or two of its members to, as you say, destroy the economies of everyone else? What kind of alliance is this? What are we trying to protect? How is it that our own officials, our own fellow citizens aren't rioting in the streets over this? Exactly. And not just because it's destroying economies, which does mean destroying lives, by the way. Let's be very clear about that. But it was the greatest act of environmental terrorism in human history.
Yeah.
You have people all over the world protesting climate change and CO2 emissions. The Nord Stream sabotage released over 400,000 tons of methane into the sea and the atmosphere. Methane is 20 times more a contributor to global warming than CO2. And yet, where's the outrage? Where's Greta Thunberg now?
Greta?
When you need her?
Where's Greta?
This is the elephant in the living room.
Welcome, brother. Very welcome.
You know, we are now, as we all know, we know this from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and others, we are now closer to the possibility of nuclear war than we've ever been. Even then, that includes the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah. And it's important to reflect on the Cuban Missile Crisis for a few reasons. First of all, many correctly note that what is happening now is the reverse Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis was brought about by the Soviet Union bringing missiles into Cuba, and the United States saying, hey, we would go to war over that. You don't put missiles 90 miles off the coast of the United States. Well, that's exactly what Russia's saying. You don't put missiles and NATO troops on our border.
Whoa!
If the situation were reversed, the United States wouldn't put up with that for a second. And of course they didn't in 1962. But the other lesson to learn from that is, despite the danger to the world, you had two leaders in John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev who were willing to negotiate their way out of that. In 13 days, by the way. And as we know, something was given and something was taken by both parties in that deal. The Soviet Union agreed to take their missiles out of Cuba, and the U.S. agreed quietly, because they always have to save face, to take missiles out of Turkey 6 months later. All of the conflict that we're seeing right now in Ukraine could have been avoided with such a deal. If NATO and the U.S., because let's face it, the U.S. is NATO, runs NATO, had simply said, hey, Ukraine won't be part of NATO. Oh, and also, Ukraine will stop bombing its own people in the Donbass, which I visited, by the way, in November. We would not be here today. But we are here today because the U.S. and NATO eschewed negotiations. They continue to do so. We know that Boris Johnson, your Prime Minister, went on a trip to Kiev last April, I believe it was, to tell Zelensky not to sign a deal that apparently there was an outline of. The U.S. and Great Britain want this war. They wanted this war, they want this war, and they want more war. Now we're threatening China.
Yeah.
And you talked about the Monroe Doctrine, where the U.S. said, we don't want Europe to interfere in Latin America. Well, we've extended that. The Carter Doctrine, Jimmy Carter Doctrine, extended it to the Persian Gulf. Said we don't want anyone interfering in the Persian Gulf, not even the Persians. And now the U.S. has the gall to say we don't want anyone interfering in the South China Sea, not even China. What kind of world is that? How can anyone accept this? This is insanity. And yet no one wants to hear the truth. No one wants to call what is insane, insane. We have to pretend that this is rational, that this is decency, when it is the most indecent thing I've ever seen in my life. And I just want to conclude by saying I did go to Russia. I spent 30 days in Russia in November, including in the Donbass. I went to Donetsk. And again, I think it's very important to reiterate what George said, and which I think everyone in this room knows, that this war did not start last year. It started in 2014 when the government in Kiev, backed to the hilt by the United States and Great Britain, began attacking its own people in the Donbass, in Donetsk, in Luhansk. And we know from the UN High Commission on Human Rights that 14,000 people died in that conflict before Russia intervened in February. And the fact that those people, those 14,000 people, have been erased from the news and from the discourse on that is shocking.
Yeah.
We are living in Orwellian times where we are supposed to just forget about all that. We are supposed to pretend that there aren't Nazis in Ukraine. You know, when I was in Donetsk, they told me that up till 1961, Donetsk was known as Stalino. Did you know that? But during the Khrushchev de-Stalinization, it changed its name back to Donetsk. But the importance of that is they have a saying in Donetsk, first Stalingrad, now Stalino. And of course what that references is that just as fascism was buried in Stalingrad in 1943, it will be buried again in Stalino, in Donetsk. And I am proud to be part of that struggle. I am proud to stand for peace. I am proud to stand for sovereignty of nations, including sovereignty of the UK. In fact, the only invasion I've ever supported in my life was the British invasion of the 1960s, and I stand by that, the Beatles and the Stones. And I stand for fighting fascism. I'm proud to stand for that. And I know you are too. Thank you for having this American come and chat. Thank you. Thank you.
I didn't know you could speak like that, man. Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you.
Outstanding.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can I grab this for you?
What an absolutely outstanding speech from an outstanding American. Dan Kovalik, thank you very much for gracing us with your presence. The next speaker is an equally formidable person. I've known her for very many years. I always think she looks far too young and glamorous to be called a pensioners leader, but that's how she styles herself these days. But she has been a feminist, a socialist, an activist for more decades than she'll want me to mention. Please welcome, from the great city of Liverpool, from which the Beatles' invasion was launched, Audrey White. Before Peter.
Thanks for that introduction, George. I think, you know, for those who don't know me, that I was a founding member of Merseyside. It's important to know that I was a founding member of Merseyside Stop the War Coalition, and that I led an industrial dispute in the 80s that you know was turned into a movie. Glenda Jackson played me, and I fought for women in against sexual harassment, and that the dispute that I led to changes in the law that protect women in the workplace to this day. I was also targeted by the Labour Party through the pages of the Jewish Chronicle. You know, the usual thing, which attacks people in our movement. And I reported them to IPSO, and the Jewish Chronicle was forced into print in the longest adjudication any newspaper has ever had to publish for the lies that they told about me. And I also took a libel case against them and settled in my favour.
Bravo.
I'm also proud to say I'm the Secretary of the Merseyside Pensioners Association. More importantly, above all this, I'm just one of the thousands and thousands of activists across the country who fought against the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, who will be fighting against this war in the Ukraine as well. And when the blinds are taken off, we'll be fighting against NATO as well. Liverpool knows the horrors of war. You know, we were the second most bombed city after the Second World War. I grew up, people my age grew up playing in bomb sites, and we only started to rebuild our city in 2008 when we won Capital of Culture. And we started to rebuild ourselves then. That's why we were an absolutely tremendously powerful anti-war movement in Merseyside. We were really proud to send 30 coaches, and I think we're the only city that hired a train when we didn't have a penny in the bank, and we had to pay £14,000 to sign a cheque for £14,000 and we didn't even have a penny to our names. We actually humiliated Condoleezza Rice when she came to our city.
Not quite the point, people.
So the headlines in the paper after that demonstration, when Jack Straw had the gall to bring Condoleezza Rice, who was responsible for Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib, we actually had the headlines in the paper the next day that Liverpool gave Condoleezza Rice the biggest unwelcome since Mosley and his black shirt in the 1930s. Blair Brown and all those people, the Jack Straws of the world, who actually we think we helped to get him the sack from that visit with Condoleezza Rice, they actually tried to manufacture consent, but they failed miserably. That was why there was 2 million of us on the streets. They actually learned these lessons. They learned the lessons that they can't allow debate. They have to stop debate. And the neocons then, as soon as Corbyn was elected, turned round and set to work. And what they did was to conduct the biggest ever witch hunt anybody has ever seen in any political party in this country. What they did was actually turn down the discussion. They actually gagged and witch hunted and expelled in the most vicious way anybody has ever seen. The neocons learned their lessons, and our movement has paid the price. And we do know about what happened nationally. Let me tell you what happened in Liverpool. Not only were our councillors, that they make sure that our councillors were compliant with the neoliberal agenda. What they did, when we turned round, we were about to anoint a new mayor in Liverpool. What happened? Starmer steps in. The new mayor was going to be a black woman, Anna Rothery, supported by Jeremy Corbyn and most of us on the left. Starmer steps in, and what does he do? Discounts the 3 candidates so he can exclude her because she was going to win, and virtually anoints Joanne Anderson, a black woman. What do we know about her? We know that she's a member of the British American Project. What's the British American Project? As John Pilger describes it, it's a CIA front, and it's like a Freemason, a loose organisation of Freemasons. It is absolutely designed for politicians and journalists to suppress anybody on the left. And that's who we ended up as the mayor of our city. We have no democracy in our city at all. And this is what's ahead for all of us, right throughout the movement. They are trying to gag us, and authoritarianism is the order of the day. Why is that relevant to war? Why is that relevant to war? What mayor we have in Liverpool? Well, of course, you read in the newspapers last year the absolutely outrageous act of holding an arms fair in a building owned by the people of Liverpool was the event that we had to demonstrate against and call to arms all of the people within the anti-war movement, because the mayor and all of the councillors were so compliant. They wrung their hands with crocodile tears and said, "Oh, it's very sad, it's not really what we want, but we can't do anything about it," which is an absolute lie, an absolute lie. We notified public interest lawyers, and they gave us the advice that it was in their own power to stop that arms fair, and we had the disgraceful situation whereby Liverpool hosted an arms fair in our anti-war city. Terrible. And of course, what are the consequences of war when you get into our communities? Of course, you saw what happened last week, where there was an outrageous situation where fascists, some of them were bussed in, some of them were just organised within our city, and some of them were just local people dragged into it, where they were actually attacking and trying to burn down a hotel in Liverpool that was housing refugees. And this is what happens when you're pro-war. This is what happens when you build up resentment against people seeking shelter from war. And at the end of the day, we as a city, we stood up proud, and we very quickly organised a meeting. We very quickly organised a massive demonstration to fight, to oppose this attack on refugees, because our city stands proud and we welcome refugees just as most decent human beings around the country do. And that's another consequence of war. Let's face it, the people who bang the drums for war are the very same people who campaign for austerity, who deprive our areas of funding so they don't have a future, so that our youths don't have a life, so that there's no housing, so that people are absolutely prone to the poison and the drip, drip, drip of the mainstream media and the right-wing press. Our councillors, Labour, the Tories, and of course the fascists who are waiting in the corners to absolutely take advantage of that situation. And that's the fight we've got right across the country, not just in Liverpool, every corner of our country, because of wars. And who is the man presiding over this authoritarianism, over this stifling and gagging of anyone who dares to put forward a nuanced debate on what this war or any war is about? Starmer. And I'm really proud that me and the Merseyside pensioners caught Starmer scurrying round in a little cafe. If you haven't seen it, 3 million other people have seen it. But what I did, it went viral. When I challenged him, I think, I have to say, I was really pleased that I challenged him on his pledges, which he betrayed. He ended up stealing the leadership of the Labour Party on, the way he came to our city, a city that bans the Sun newspaper, and yet he reports all the time. I challenged him on the witch hunt which is silencing everybody, from councillors to MPs, even to the Socialist group of MPs who cowardly withdrew their name from the anti-war letter that was drawn up by the Stop the War organisation. But I'd say I do have one regret, and the regret is the point being, he's got no different, Starmer has no different policies than the Tories. But the one thing that I didn't get to say to him, because I was manhandled by one of his minders, was when it comes to war, which is a fundamental issue as war, there's no difference between the Tories and the current Labour Party, absolutely none whatsoever. So I really regret that I never got to say that, because it's in my DNA. I started my activity through being on the anti-Vietnamese, the Vietnam War, against the Vietnam War, all those years ago. And all I'd say is, we are now living in a one-party state. Absolutely. We're living in much scarier and authoritarian times than when we was trying to stop the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. But I'd say to everyone here, the anti-war movement has the power to shine a light towards peace. It always had. And this is why this event is so important, and I hope there's more of them. I'm proud to be here today. I think we've got a job of work to do to break down the lies and the misinformation, and I've never, ever, ever seen the scale of propaganda where you... Yeah, when the war first broke out, you went to Marks and Spencer's to buy a loaf of bread, and he said to you, "Do you want to give £1 to Ukraine?" And I said, actually, I want to give £1 to Palestine. How do I go about doing it? Don't get me wrong. The people in Ukraine are being murdered. They're being sacrificed on the altar of NATO and America and Europe and all the gangsters that are driving this war. We support the working class. We support the working class of Russia, of Ukraine, of Palestine, of Europe, of Britain, and of America, who basically are anti-war. Everybody's instinct is to be anti-war, except for these neocons and the rulers of the world. I'm going to finish on this. My message to Starmer is that the anti-war movement will not be silenced. We won't be browbeaten. We won't be intimidated by their bully boy tactics, all their stitch-ups. We're here to say, and I say no to war everywhere, and no to NATO, and let's fight for peace.
Bravo! Whoa. Absolutely wonderful. Wonderful. Wow. Thank you, Audrey. John Lennon would have been proud of that address. I'm absolutely sure of that. Paul, maybe not so much. Well, I must say, the bottom was reached when Rod Stewart made a sterling plea for the war in Ukraine just yesterday. John Lennon, we miss you. Audrey White, we're lucky that we still have, and long may she continue. Absolutely. Another great American, yet another great American, has joined us hot foot during the course of the meeting. He was the principal organizer with other forces, and here I should make the point that while this NO2NATO, NO2WAR event, and I hope ongoing organization, arose as an initiative from myself and Chris Williamson, the Workers' Party of Britain, and the Socialist Labour Party, who are proud to work together and march together. This is in no way, our event and our organization is in no way restricted. There's no blood tests. You don't have to be a supporter of our parties. You don't have to be left, whatever that means nowadays. You can be left, you can be centre, you can be right. All that is required is that you're against NATO and you're against NATO wars. Our next speaker personified that in the United States and received the entirely predictable, vitriolic brickbats of the sectarians who imagine that on an issue which could literally be about, in the worst case, whether or not there is a planet to argue over, whether or not there are human beings to try to persuade and lead, we and he took the view that the broadest possible mass movement of the kind that we built against the Iraq war needs to be built again over this issue. He's the leader of what is surely the hope of the people of the United States, though that's their business, the People's Party of America. He's the leader of Rage Against the War Machine in Washington, D.C. He is Nick Brana, and he's here with us today. Nick, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Right here.
Thank you all for welcoming me, the People's Party, and Rage Against the War Machine, your collaborators from across the pond. It's a great honor to be with you and to be here. I booked the ticket to come here just a couple days ago because after Rage Against the War Machine, I thought, I cannot miss this. I can't miss what is happening in London, what is going to happen a week after our rally. So I wanted to come and share what happened in the United States and its significance. A week ago, we brought 3,000 people out to the Lincoln Memorial, an iconic location where Dr. Martin Luther King and others have given their speeches against war and poverty, and they joined us there to rage against the war machine. And very much like George said, we did it by removing all the other litmus tests and by saying that you don't have to meet any other kind of ideological criteria, you don't have to meet some mold. All you have to do is oppose the horror of this war and the injustice of NATO and come and join us and rage against the war machine. I imagine that the people of America share something distinct that I've heard talked about today with the people of the United Kingdom, and that is that we're tired of our hard-earned money going to these wars. $100 billion in the United States has been spent on top of an $850 billion annual military budget that grows every year while programs to reduce poverty crash, while programs for food stamps crash, while homelessness explodes, and people are getting tired of it. Because it's $1 billion here, $2 billion there, tanks over here, Patriot weapon systems over there, one after the other in the news, while everybody sees that their own lives are becoming worse and worse, while all of our funds are being shipped over to Ukraine for these wars and risking a nuclear war that would annihilate all of us. Now, I think it's well recognized in this room that you live in a one-party state based on the reaction earlier. In the United States, we similarly live in a one-party state. But we've had such a profound transformation in our left party, the Democrat Party, that I used to work for. I worked for several politicians in the Democrat Party, last of which was Bernie Sanders, whose betrayal was the worst of all at this point. He is behind the war. Never did I think that after working for Bernie Sanders on his revolutionary 2016 campaign, he would condemn me as an agent, a paid agent of Russia, when I confronted him on his support of the war. Yet he embodies what the Democratic Party has become and what the two-party war machine has become. And in fact, the Democratic Party is now worse than the Republican Party because there is a bill that was put forward by Matt Gaetz, a Republican, and signed on by 14 Republicans to oppose more funding. Where are the Democrats? Nowhere. Zero Democrats. In fact, some of the progressive Democrats that are supposed to be the ones that stand for us, there's a caucus in the House of Representatives of 100 progressive Democrats. They meekly put forward a letter to Biden that said, let's negotiate, let's pursue peace, let's negotiate peace. At the same time that we're giving the billions of dollars in the weapons, they couldn't even bring themselves to call an end to that. And yet that was too much, because within 24 hours, when they faced the slightest pushback from the media, they withdrew the letter, tails between their legs, And since then, that was in October, since then not a single Democrat has spoken out against the war. Only a handful of Republicans.
Simply a shame.
It is a shame. It is a shame. So, it's a great honor to join you in opposing this war. And I very much hope that an international coalition to abolish NATO comes out of this, of which...
Woo!
And I come representing the comrades in the United States that spanned from left to right, to libertarians, to socialists, to communists, to leftists, to people in the center, all across the political spectrum. And I come to say that Rage Against the War Machine, the People's Party, the Libertarian Party, we will be a part of that with you.
Woo!
The United States will be a part of that with you.
Woo!
Last thing I want to share is the media was quick to try to write off our protest, which was the largest protest since the Iraq War. The largest anti-war protest since the Iraq War. 3,000 people. Our march stretched several blocks across the reflecting pool, 17th Street, all the way up to the White House when we marched from the Lincoln Memorial to the White House.
We saw on our team.
Oh, good.
Arrest that woman.
And the media is especially MSNBC, which is again supposed to be our left-wing media. It was the fastest and the most emphatic to ridicule the rally. Rachel Maddow covered it and decried it as a small, insignificant rally of a bunch of kooks. And it struck me, you know, it was so insignificant that you covered it 3 times on your network. It was so insignificant that it was covered on Fox News on primetime by Tucker Carlson. It was so insignificant that it was covered by almost 200 local news stations across the country. It was so insignificant that everybody who gathered there that day said, we have to come back with twice as many people next time.
Woo!
So, what's happening today, what's happening in other countries in Europe, as you all know, in other countries, other cities, Berlin, Bonn, Paris, this weekend, is a collective revolt against NATO and against the war and against the prospect of nuclear war and against our money being wasted on endless wars. A collective revolt that is taking shape against NATO, within NATO. And I think that we are going to win. We are going to abolish NATO. We're going to end this war. We're going to we're going to abolish nuclear weapons. And we're going to return those funds to where they should be, and that is to the people of our countries, to feed, clothe, house people, to end poverty, to end homelessness. That's where the funds should go. That's what we need.
Woo.
Thank you all.
Fantastic, man. Unbelievable. Brilliant. Brilliant. Nick, a very great Irishman by the name of Oscar Wilde said we were two peoples divided by a common language. But we speak the same language. No to NATO, no to war. That's our language. That's what unites us. And here I want to make this point. There will be people who are pacifists in this room. I myself am not. But you can be a pacifist. That's not sufficient. Because as long as NATO exists, and as long as we are members, in your case, the leaders of NATO, the permanent, perpetual danger of war will exist. It is a war alliance, ever expanding, way beyond the North Atlantic and now in the South China Sea. If we don't tackle this question, and I criticize other anti-war organizations for avoiding this point, the main problem is at home. Our main problem is at home, in our own country, in its war alliance with NATO and the United States. I hope to get a chance to say more about that later. Our next speaker is the distinguished former British Ambassador, His Excellency, the Honourable Peter Ford. Please give him a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Like Audrey, I am also from Liverpool, or as it's also about to be called, with Eurovision coming, Kiev on Mersey. A great city come down dreadfully, and not just at the hands of Real Madrid. This is a self-inflicted calamity to submit to the whims of NATO vision, because that's what Eurovision has become. It's just a propaganda exercise, as it was last year. I want to broaden the lens a bit here and talk not just about Ukraine, but about NATO's activities elsewhere in the world. Technically, NATO's operations are confined to what they call in-area, but we're not going to be pedantic here. We're going to call things by their real names, and NATO is just American exceptionalism, American imperialism at work through a particular military structure. So I'm going to talk mainly about the Middle East, but from the perspective of British interests. I'm going to be transactional about this. You remember how Trump was transactional about US interests. What works for America? America first. Well, I think it's a legitimate approach to foreign affairs and would get us into far fewer wars if we applied it. And indeed, Trump himself, by putting America first, actually wanted to downgrade America's involvement with NATO and wanted, for example, to withdraw from Syria. But he was undermined from within by the deep state. Anyway, we're going to look for a moment at where British interests have been served or not served by our appurtenance and participation in NATO. Think about it, all the conflicts that this country has gotten involved in, been dragged into since the end of the last Cold War. In none of them, in fact, did we have any direct interest. The war, so-called war on terrorism, when 9/11 happened, it was America that was targeted, not Britain. America that brought 9/11 onto itself by its policies in the Middle East, pursuing its imperial aims and its support for Israel. There was no need for Britain to get involved, but blindly, unreflectingly, we let ourselves sign up to fight America's wars in the Middle East. And we went into Afghanistan. We got stuck there for 2 decades. It cost many lives and much treasure. And in the process, we put ourselves in the crosshairs of America's jihadi enemies. Would Al-Qaeda have staged terror attacks in Britain if we'd not gone into Afghanistan? I doubt it. Other European countries, not members of NATO, were not attacked. Countries like Austria, Ireland, and Switzerland. So we brought Islamist terror onto ourselves in pursuit of the aims of America and NATO. And in the end, what good did it do going into Afghanistan? After 2 decades, we had to withdraw. The Taliban have gone back. They're now stronger than ever. And we've been landed with filling our hotels with Afghan refugees. We have been made fools of, or rather we've made ourselves utter fools. And it was the same with Iraq. We were never threatened by Iraq. No British interest was at stake or at risk. Why would Iraq have wanted to pick a quarrel with Britain? Iraq would only ever have wanted the purported chemical weapons in order to defend itself or to use on internal enemies. Anyway, it turned out they didn't have chemical weapons anyway, although we were persuaded by America that they did. But we went along with the US because that's our default option. That's what we always do, unthinkingly. We joined the coalition of the willing, or I would call it coalition of the willfully blind. And look what good the Iraq conflict did to Britain. Again, we were caught in a quagmire for years, a quagmire out of which emerged ISIS. And then we got dragged into conflict with ISIS. The thing with ISIS is the clue's in the name, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, not Islamic State in America and Britain. They considered their enemies were first and foremost what they call the apostate infidel regimes of Iraq and Syria. But we got sucked into conflict on America's coattails with ISIS after we'd earlier got sucked into conflict with Al-Qaeda. There was no need for Britain to become involved. And funnily enough, America itself suffered barely any blowback from this terrorism, not on the homeland anyway, but in Europe, of course, we suffered greatly. Not just from terrorist attacks, but also in the form of massive migration. I'm not saying I'm against migration, that's another debate, and there are many positives from it, but it's unarguable, I think, that our societies have suffered massive challenges as a result of blowback from our NATO-inspired wars in the Middle East. All the conflicts from Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria pushed in our direction many thousands of people. And there's a kind of poetic or ironic justice to it, that we made war on their countries and they've retaliated with their own people. And it was all so unnecessary for us, Britain, to get involved. The foreign policy establishment in this country, if they were honest with themselves, would be making a hard analysis and seeing that their policy led in a way to the Brexit, when they were, to a man and a woman, Europhiles and Remainers. But the blowback from the NATO wars led quite directly to Brexit, and now to more potential trouble in this country. If only we had made peace our priority, many, or if not all, of these bad outcomes could have been avoided. Now, my background culture, of course, is the Foreign Office, and I can hear the Foreign Office person at the back of my brain saying, yes, but this is the price that we have to pay for being a great power, for our seat on the UN Security Council, and for being a trusted ally of the United States. And if we did not follow the United States, if we were not a leading member of NATO, we would lose our seat at the top table, we would lose influence. But what influence is this? The privilege of being dragged into conflicts, none of which serve British interests, but on the contrary, cause untold problems for us? That is no kind. The best way to serve any country's security interests is not to make enemies in the first place. And now we're being pushed perilously close into hot war with Russia. Again, I ask, what is the specific British interest at stake here? To hear the pro-war camp, to hear their arguments is an exercise in absurdity. Their reasoning appears to be, although this is rarely actually articulated, their reasoning appears to be that if the Ukrainian domino falls, then the wicked Putin will come marching across the North European plain, he'll gobble up Poland in no time, and then he'll be marching across northern Germany, through Belgium, and very soon he'll be at the gates of Calais. I mean, that is the level of their discourse, but it's not actually articulated. But that is what they appear to be saying. What else are they saying? They believe that Russia, which has struggled to deal with the conflict in the relatively puny Ukraine, could somehow become a mastodon rampaging across northern Europe, gobbling up countries and threatening this country. It's absolute lunacy. And only I'm searching and failing to find a polite word here, but only cretins only cretins like Tobias Ellwood, the warmongering, hysterical chair of the Commons Defence Committee, could believe such nonsense. No British interest would suffer if Ukraine disappeared entirely off the map as an independent state. We have no major stake there. Anyway, Ukraine disappearing off the map is not going to happen anyway, not desired by Russia. All it would have taken to prevent the dreadful situation where we are all now is for a reasonable compromise at the very start, before hostilities began, that Ukraine would agree to a stato vis-à-vis NATO similar to that of Austria, how terrible that would have been. How dreadful. It would have granted genuine autonomy to the Donbass, and it would have accepted the results of the Crimea referendum. How much a better deal for Ukraine itself would that not have been than anything they're likely to get now? And British interests would not have been affected adversely one whit if NATO had encouraged Ukraine to settle for such terms. Instead, the warmonger Johnson was in the lead in persuading Ukraine not to settle. And by the way, that is obviously Johnson's game. Now he looks forward to the day when Sunak will be moved aside as an obvious loser in the 2024 general election. Johnson will step in as the Churchill de nos jours, as the warmonger, the war candidate. But Britain has ended up, as we all know, only too well now, a victim of a galloping affliction, a toxic cocktail of jingoism, NATO-philia, and Russophobia. And as a result, we're hemorrhaging billions in terms of direct military assistance to Ukraine, hundreds of millions to house refugees, and because of sanctions on Russia, we've inflamed already surging inflation through high energy prices. So far from defending British interests, we've not just shot ourselves in the foot, we practically shot our legs off entirely. I conclude it's all down basically to our unswerving devotion to NATO. They say love is blind, it certainly is. Until we wake up from our trance, we're doomed to keep repeating this era of being dragged into ever more serious conflicts, with the really big one, China, just over the horizon. Thank you.
Bravo. Thank you very much indeed, Honourable Peter Ford. How I wish you were still in the Foreign Office and applying some of that wisdom, perspicacity. The purpose of a government, the purpose of a Foreign Office is to protect the interests and safety of British people and British interests, and you so comprehensively demonstrate how the precise opposite has been achieved by those in charge of our national affairs, not just now, but for a very long time indeed. How long ago it seems when we were told things could only get better. How long ago it seems indeed. I said earlier that this initiative came from the next speaker and myself and our respective parties, but I must say, at the risk of embarrassing him, a thing or two about him. I was, I think, the first to say, certainly the most consistent to say, because even some of those who also said it soon stopped doing so. Chris Williamson is the Dreyfus of our age. He was subjected to a grotesque character assassination on an entirely 100% bogus pretext. Chris Williamson was a campaigning Labour Member of Parliament par excellence. You could not get a better one. I speak as a former Labour Member of Parliament myself. He was out on the road on a motorbike for much of it, going around the country, rallying people to the Labour leadership then of Jeremy Corbyn. A job one might have thought was part of the job description. One might have thought something that more of his colleagues might well have been doing, and we might not have ended in the way that we have. He was fitted up in the most ludicrous way. No one who actually watched his lips move and the video on screen could possibly agree to the construction that was placed upon his words. But worst of all, he won't like me saying this perhaps, but worst of all, when it was done, all of his friends began to abandon him. One by one, line by line, row by row, they disappeared. And I became quite personally affected by it. I had suffered some of the same myself, but I watched this man, entirely inoffensive man. I mean, I offend people, but Chris Williamson never offended anyone. He never did anything but good. And he ended up politically destroyed. But I believe he'll come back. I believe Chris Williamson will come back. Chris Williamson.
Well, blimey, what an introduction. Thank you very much indeed. And it's an amazing privilege, I've got to say, to be addressing you this morning alongside such an amazing array of wonderful speakers.
Chris, lift the mic.
Lift the mic. Right, sorry. I was just saying what a wonderful privilege it is to be addressing you this morning and to be sharing a platform with such an incredible array of fantastic speakers. And George said some nice things about me. Let me return the favour, because I was indeed abandoned by people who I thought were my comrades in the Socialist campaign group of Labour MPs, people who I admired, people who, maybe it's my working class background, you know, maybe I've got a bit of a chip on my shoulder, I don't know, but didn't feel I was worthy of. When I got elected to Parliament, I suffered from imposter syndrome, didn't feel I was worthy of gracing the green benches when there were people like titans of the magnitude of John McDonnell, I thought. God, how wrong could I be? But George Galloway is the personification of solidarity. George never left my side. And George unfairly gets a lot of brickbats. And George said that he would never leave my side. And let me say, I will never leave your side, George. You are an amazing principled leader. And I tell you what, if he'd have been the leader of the Labour Party, my God, we'd have been in power right now, transforming this country, wouldn't we? But listen, we've heard from two great Americans today, and that's a wonderful privilege. And there's another great American who wanted to join us today, but unfortunately wasn't able to make the flight in the way in which Nick was amazingly able to do from Washington. Amazing. I was on a Twitter space with him yesterday, and here he is today. How amazing is that? And I want to thank you, Nick, because you again are an inspiration, and it's wonderful. And I know people like Sean Bloor former coordinator of the resist movement before we joined forces with the Socialist Labour Party, was really privileged to be able to meet you. So thank you, and obviously Audrey and Peter Ford and everybody that we've heard from this morning. It is, as I say, an amazing privilege. But let me just say a word from Denis Kucinich, who's a former congressman, and he just has given me a statement that he'd like me to read out to you today. So let me just do that before I get into my speech. He said this: "As you gather today in London, know there are many Americans who are cheering on your efforts to awaken the United Kingdom to the disaster which awaits everyone should NATO members continue to choose escalation over diplomacy in dealing with Russia. The war in Ukraine should have never happened. Western leaders have used the brave men and women of Ukraine as pawns in an international power play to isolate Russia and destroy its energy resources. The destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines under the orders of President Biden, as reported by Seymour Hersh, is a grim reminder of how the domestic security of the German people in winter was cynically sacrificed to the callous designs of global domination by ideologues. Let us stand together for the security of our nations and the world, for an end to the war in Ukraine, for an end to the danger of nuclear war, and for a new beginning, assuring human and ecological security under the banner of strength through peace." Thank you, Dennis. Now, people who know me know that I have a tendency to talk for too long. In fact, I was accused a little bit of that on that Twitter space yesterday, actually. But so I'm going to do a red speech today, so in order to try and stick to time and give an opportunity for audience participation and hear contributions from the floor. But look, I'm going to talk about the Labour Party today. I was a member of the Labour Party for 43 years, a member of Parliament for 7.5 years, had 2 terms as a member of Parliament. And in the early 1980s, when the peace movement was in the ascendancy, I genuinely thought that the Labour Party could be the catalyst to reverse the arms race. Tony Benn was in the ascendancy, and the long-time peace campaigner, Michael Foot, was elected as a Labour Party leader in November of 1980. But the decades that followed were a rude awakening. So I'm going to talk briefly today about the Labour Party's response to NATO from its inception in 1949 to the present day. But first, I want to say a word or two about someone who should be celebrated, but who most people have never heard of. I'm talking about Smedley Butler, who retired from the US military in 1931. He'd been a general in the US Marine Corps and was a loyal servant of US imperialism. He joined the Marines as an idealistic 16-year-old and spent much of his military career thinking he was engaged in a noble endeavour. But the light of experience changed him. He came to the awful realisation that his military career wasn't in the service of a noble cause after all. He recognised that he was simply serving the profit motive of big business. And after he retired, he didn't pull any punches about the real motive for war. He said he'd spent most of his life, and I quote, as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and for the bankers. And he added, in short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. In 1935, he also published a book entitled War is a Racket, which in my opinion should be taught in every school in the land. He said it's the only racket in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. Now that was 88 years ago, but rather than heed Butler's words, political leaders, including Labour Party leaders, have made the situation considerably worse. In the modern world, it's NATO that acts as a muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and for the bankers. And the Labour Party is one of NATO's biggest cheerleaders. Yet those of us who campaign for peace and oppose war are smeared and demonised by NATO's liberal lackeys and the corporate media which does the war machine's bidding. But we cannot let the war machine and its toadying trolls and sycophantic media hacks prevail. These trolls pulled out all the stops to get this event cancelled today, including a campaign of intimidation against 2 of the previous venues who'd accepted our booking. Yet here we are, making a stand for peace and humanity. And we can only go from strength to strength, in my opinion, because people are increasingly coming to the realisation that what we're demanding is plain common sense. But all the political class on both sides of the Atlantic are enthralled to NATO. They're addicted to war. So they use public money to acquire more and more weapons. But it was Dwight D. Eisenhower, a US Republican president, who said in his valedictory address in 1961, January of that year, that we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by what he described as the military-industrial complex. He said, every gun that's made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. What was true in 1961 is even more pertinent today, isn't it? The arms industry has never been more influential. So what about the Labour Party's record on the NATO military alliance? The party of prominent peace campaigners like Bertrand Russell, Fenner Brockway, Michael Foot, Tony Benn and yes, Jeremy Corbyn. Well, NATO's seen as an article of faith by today's Labour Party. Sir Keir Starmer says, and I quote, "Labour's commitment to NATO is unshakable." And in an article for The Guardian in February last year, he even suggested that the creation of NATO was as important as the creation of the National Health Service. How ridiculous is that? David Lammy, Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary, claims, and I quote, "As members of NATO, our security border isn't the cliffs of Dover, but the frontiers of our Eastern European allies, the border Ukraine." And as if that wasn't disturbing enough, Labour's Shadow Defence Secretary, John Healey, has been falling over himself to support the government's misuse of public money, to pump billions of pounds into prolonging NATO's proxy war in Ukraine. Healey's on record last month saying the government has Labour's fullest backing for military assistance to Ukraine. And he went on to say this, "As the first anniversary of Russia's invasion approaches, this will help to reassure Ukrainians that Britain will stand with them for as long as it takes and signal to Putin that things will get worse, not better, for Russia." Look, it's obvious, isn't it, from Lammy's and Healey's outbursts, that Labour's upper echelons are just warmongers, reckless warmongers. There's no talk about peace, just more war. I mean, even Winston Churchill said jaw is better than war. But these Blairite cutouts are not interested in jaw. They just relentlessly bang the drums of war. And they're not alone. Even John McDonnell, who I mentioned earlier, a stalwart of the so-called socialist, and I say so-called socialist because they ain't socialists, the so-called socialist campaign group of Labour MPs is supporting more weapons for NATO's proxy war in Ukraine. And he bizarrely claims that giving weapons to Ukraine is, in his words, a pathway to peace. Can you believe it? And 5 other members, and trade union leaders as well, 5 other members of the so-called socialist campaign group, Ian Lavery, Clive Lewis, Rachel Maskell, Lloyd Russell Moyle and Nadia Whittam, have all signed a statement demanding that all the UK's surplus military equipment, all of it, that's due to be replaced, should be gifted to Ukraine. They even specified the equipment they wanted to donate. It included all the surplus Challenger tanks, Typhoon fighter aircraft, armoured reconnaissance vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles. They They claimed this would, and I quote, help Ukraine win more quickly, with less suffering. I mean, honestly, these characters couldn't possibly be more delusional, could they? And let's remember, it was Clem Attlee in 1945, well, the 1945 to 51 Labour government, that helped to establish NATO in the first place in 1949. In fact, Attlee's government was a key architect of the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. And in spite of the bellicose rhetoric about the USSR drawing an iron curtain across Europe, a phrase coined by Winston Churchill in 1946, NATO was created 6 years before the Warsaw Pact even came into existence. So Labour's been complicit in the NATO war machine from the very start. And so let me just take you through Labour's manifesto pledges from the mid-1950s onwards. Labour's 1955 manifesto boasted about taking the lead in building up the North Atlantic Alliance. 4 years later, Labour was proclaiming that it stood resolutely by NATO. By 1964, the party's manifesto was asserting that Labour took the lead in facing the harsh realities of the Cold War and in creating the NATO alliance. At the 1966 election, Labour stated that it firmly supports NATO. In 1970, it gave a firm commitment to NATO. But by February 1974, Labour's manifesto took a slightly different tone. In that election, the party was calling for the phasing out of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And the same wording was included in the October 1974 manifesto, as well as the manifestos in 1979 and 1983 as well. But by 1987, Labour's defence policy was once again, and I quote, based squarely and firmly on Britain's membership of NATO. In 1992, Labour once again said it was committed to membership of NATO. And in 1997, the year Tony Blair came to power, Labour said Britain's security will continue to be based on NATO. However, in 2001, Labour seemed to forget about its servile commitment to NATO because the manifesto made no reference to it. Mind you, 2 years previously, the Blairite MP George Robertson, who George I'm sure will remember, was appointed as NATO's Secretary-General, a position he held until 2003. But the 2005 manifesto made up for the previous omissions by referring to NATO as the cornerstone of Britain's defence policy. And in 2010, Labour spoke about NATO's going to tackle security challenges. And in 2015, Labour said it would strengthen Britain's long-standing membership of NATO. And significantly, in view of NATO's proxy war right now in Ukraine, that same manifesto also claimed that the crisis in Ukraine has demonstrated the importance of NATO. That crisis was, of course, the aftermath of the US and EU-backed coup in Ukraine, which had seen NATO's puppet regime in Kiev embarking on a military offensive against the people of East Ukraine, who overwhelmingly opposed the coup. Later that year, of course, Jeremy Corbyn was elected as the leader of the Labour Party in a one-member, one-vote election that he won by a landslide. And of course, this sent shockwaves through the establishment. Senior military figures were apoplectic about a peacenik becoming the leader of the official opposition and a potential Prime Minister. People might remember this in an interview with the Sunday Times. A serving army general gave a stark warning to a potential future Corbyn-led government that wanted to shrink the armed forces, scrap Trident or pull out of NATO. He said, the army just wouldn't stand for it. And he threatened to use, and I quote, whatever means possible, fair or foul, to prevent that. You can't put a maverick in charge of a country's security. Now that was a threat to commit treason, a coup d'etat by the military. But the general suffered no consequences. In any event, he needn't have worried, because even the two manifestos under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership in 2017 and 2019 contained unambiguous commitments to NATO. So although Sir Keir Starmer's belligerent rhetoric is more overtly favourable towards NATO and the war machine today, the truth is he's simply restating what's been the Labour Party's official policy now for almost 74 years. Look, is started by lies, including the Second World War. So let me conclude with the words of Julian Assange, and I know many people here are holding up banners today in support of Julian Assange, and people will be familiar with these words, I'm sure. But he said, "When we understand that wars come about as a result of lies peddled to the British public and the American public and the public all over Europe and other countries, that the reality that's constructed around us is constructed by liars, it should lead us to an optimistic understanding that if wars can be started by lies, peace can be started by truth." And that must be... And that, comrades and friends, that must be our task when we leave this rally today. As John Lennon said, all we are saying is give peace a chance.
Hey.
Thank you.
Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you very much, Chris. John Lennon's getting a good hearing here today. Hope you'll take that back to Liverpool, Audrey. And how we wish our friend Julian Assange could be with us today. But if he could hear us, if he can hear us, now or later, let me say on behalf, I think, of all of us, that we never left your side. Even when people were, some of them quite surprising, demanding you be extradited to Sweden on fake charges, or that you must face justice. Even when people were saying that, we never left your side. You are a tribune of the people, Julian Assange. We miss you terribly, and your work will shine brightly forevermore. And I want to say to his wife and children, as I know that they will hear us, to please convey our solidarity greetings to Julian Assange. A big round of applause for Julian Assange. Now,
it's a simple question. Do you think the estate of George Orwell would have a case against the ruling elites for nicking 1984? It's meant to be a warning, not a manual.
it is, I'm not a fan myself of George Orwell, but the book has uncannily predicted the development of our society. Uncannily. We are always at war with East Asia, you'll remember, from the book. Well, we are about to plunge into, and this is a point in a way that hasn't been made so far, it's not just that we're fighting Russia, we are openly preparing for a war with China. We can't defeat Russia, and we want to fight Russia and China together. The lunatics have taken over the asylum. They really have taken over the asylum. Yes, the other gentleman with glasses. Yes, sir.
Hello, George. My name is Dean O'Brien. I'm a freelance correspondent, and I've been covering the conflict in Ukraine since it started. I've been travelling to Ukraine for over 14 years. Initially, I started in Ukraine. I witnessed the Maidan. Then I travelled to the other side, Donbass. Once you've gone there, I don't know if people are familiar, but you can never return to Ukraine again because they put you on what they call the ironic peacemaker hit list. So you're on a government website in Ukraine. They print all your personal details, that you're a traitor. But I went there and witnessed the devastation that the Ukrainian government have unleashed upon their own people. I'm not paid by anybody, I'm just a normal guy. I just went out there with my camera and I witnessed it myself. And more recently I visited Transnistria, I went to Serbia, Belgrade, where you may be familiar. If you want to talk about NATO bombings, you can go and see this television centre where they killed numerous journalists and reporters. So yeah, but I just want to thank you personally and the Workers' Party for sticking with the real people.
Thank you very much. I thank you very much. I spent a bit of time in Serbia myself and have been to the site of the NATO bombardment. I'm not inordinately proud of the stand I took against the war in Iraq. It didn't take Einstein to work out that that was a very bad idea, but I am proud of the fact that I was, under the leadership of Tony Benn, one of those who pointed out that the dismemberment, the destruction of Yugoslavia and the bombing by Blair and Clinton by NATO of Belgrade was a precursor of invasions and disasters still to come, and that if we allowed it, and some fools went along with it, if we allowed it to pass unopposed, it would merely embolden the invaders of country after country after country. And I am proud of that because we were few in number. Mr. Benn was our incredible, courageous, eloquent leader who saw instantly the clarity of that point. But we only had 12 of us in Parliament at that time opposing the war on Yugoslavia. And so it has turned out that, emboldened by the success of their enterprise in Yugoslavia, that they went on to invade and occupy country after country after country. This far, no further. We will not allow NATO and the war machine to go unchallenged any further. And so, I want to propose a resolution to you, which we'll do at the second session, about which I'll speak in a minute. This is the resolution we want you to pass. This gathering in London on 25 February 2023 resolves to establish in the UK and Ireland a No to NATO campaigning organisation to carry the fight against imperialist wars to the widest possible audience, to appoint an interim leadership, emphasise interim, of George Galloway, Chris Williamson and Andy Hudd, the Vice President of ASLEF, to direct the organisation's work until a wider leadership can be elected, to encourage throughout the world all efforts of similar organisations and to coordinate with them in global action. I move that resolution and ask for your support for it. Thank you. Can I say that that is carried by acclamation? I'm very grateful to you. It's been a fantastic event. I think you'll all agree. It has entirely vindicated not just the decision to create such an initiative, but to stand up to the bullies who tried to threaten us and bomb us and all the rest. They haven't showed up. They're online goons sitting in their mothers' back bedrooms in their underpants, threatening this fine and noble group of men and women who have made this possible today. So I'm going to call, as it were, a recess, as we used to call it in Parliament, until 2 o'clock. If you're intending staying for the second session, then you can either stay in your seat or leave and come back. But if you're leaving now, and if I don't see you again, thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of this effort. God bless you all. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Excellent.
Sharing a platform with you again.
And you, it's been too long, mate.
NATO was founded in 1949 with the stated goal of being a defensive organisation dedicated to supposedly protecting Europe from Soviet invasion, and also intending to prevent the spread of communism. In this role, it joined forces with many repressive elements in post-war Europe and even promoted a number of prominent Nazis to senior positions. But just as importantly, NATO was formed by the US in order to keep European states subservient to the interest of US imperialism. In other words, European states wouldn't be running off doing their own thing in the geopolitical arena. They'd be taking their orders from Uncle Sam. The Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991. If NATO really had been a defensive organisation, it would also have been dissolved at that time. Instead, it was emboldened by the demise of the Soviet Union and soon began to expand eastwards, leading to many of our problems today. There was a great opportunity to bring a new Russia under the umbrella of a peaceful Europe, but NATO was not interested in peace, or ever has been. NATO is a war machine. It promotes war. It has a vested interest in war. It works for the interests of US imperialism and the military-industrial complex. If there was no money to be made from war, NATO would cease to exist. War is a money racket, and so is NATO. NATO say they are a defence alliance, but they want peace. But tell that to the millions in Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya who have suffered so much at the hands of NATO. NATO has nothing to gain from peace. The eastern expansion of NATO has totally destabilised the entire region, resulting in today's war in Ukraine. The EU pretends that today's war was unprovoked. This is nonsense. It was provoked. They know it was provoked. That's why they call it unprovoked. But that doesn't make it justified. It was an illegal invasion, and there's always an alternative to war. What happens now? Do we allow the political warmongers to continue to dictate the narrative, or do we take ownership of it? The vast majority of politicians and the mainstream media want the war to continue, no matter how many lives it costs. But the people of Europe want the war to stop. They want peace. It's time to protest. It's time to march for peace, march for an end to the NATO war machine, and march for an end to our warmongering politicians. The choice now is peace or barbarism. We want peace.
So here we are at the anniversary of the war in Ukraine, and the slaughter continues unabated. Tens of thousands of people dead, millions displaced, and destruction on a catastrophic scale. Yet the battle cry in the West is arm Ukraine more. It's not just about helping Ukraine defend itself, but about Ukraine must win. In April last year, there was a deal on the table which would have seen Russia withdraw to pre-February 2022 positions in return for Ukrainian neutrality and a guarantee that Ukraine would not join NATO. For that deal to work, the West would have to row in behind it and guarantee that it would respect it. Instead, Boris Johnson was sent to scupper the deal and urge Ukraine to keep fighting. Ukraine fought on, and a year later it is in a worse position than it was then. Many thousands of people who were alive then are now dead. Glory, they say, to Ukraine, but how many more months of glory can Ukraine take? NATO countries masquerade as friends to Ukraine, but they aren't doing this in Ukraine's interests, but in their own. Ukraine isn't being armed to win, but to achieve a stalemate with Russia. Neither side in this war can win outright. The strategy is to arm Ukraine just enough to keep it in the fight, ensuring massive profits for the arms industry. Of course, I condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine unequivocally. The Russian government must bear responsibility for this war, but it's not enough to just condemn Russia. If the peace movement in Europe and North America is serious about stopping war, then lining up with NATO just isn't going to cut it. Doing that would obscure the decades of militarization and confrontation that preceded Russia's invasion. NATO states are now using the war as a pretext to militarize further and faster, sparking a global arms race which threatens to lead us all into the abyss. In the last year, there's been a hurricane of pro-war propaganda whose main aim isn't to help Ukraine, but to prevent the peace that people so desperately need. There has been a conscious and concerted effort to reduce the complexity of this conflict down to two simplistic positions. Either you're with NATO or you're with Russia. It's time for that lie to go. Those peddling it have had everything their way for a year now, and the results are there for everyone to see. Ukraine in ruins, mounds of dead, a world on the brink. Of course people are angry at Putin for this war, but they're also furious at the recklessness and stupidity of our own leaders. We have no power over the decisions of the Russian government. The people who do, our friends in the Russian peace movement, are facing stark repression to oppose the barbarous illegal aggression of the Russian government, as we once opposed the Iraq war. Our duty of solidarity with them, as internationalists and peace activists, is to oppose it on our side. We must oppose the war makers on both sides of this conflict, who thrive on confrontation and who feed on each other's hostility to push for more escalation. If we don't organise to restrain these forces on both sides of the global conflict, we may face a world war in our lifetime. It's time now for the peace movement to intervene, and for the silent majority who want peace to be silent no more. We need to take to the streets to demand our leaders stop fueling conflict, stop ensuring that the war is kept going, and instead work for peace and a diplomatic solution as the only way forward. We're not going to stand for another year of this, not another day, not another minute. We demand peace on our continent now, and we won't settle for anything less.
Most of you will be aware of the slightly tortuous journey to Grafton Way via two cowardly venues that took our money, substantial money, and then ran away from the intimidators of NATO or NAFO or NAFO or NAF, whatever they are properly described. But this gathering and the one that preceded it is a demonstration of the fact that we will not be silenced by the war machine. We will not be intimidated. We are not afraid of you. We're afraid of war. We're afraid of nuclear war, and we're determined to stop it. That's why we have gathered here in such numbers today. This organization, this title, this logo was originally an idea of myself and my colleague Chris Williamson and our parties, the Workers' Party of Britain and the Socialist Labour Party. But I want to make something abundantly clear. Unlike other organizations, there are no ideological blood tests here. We welcome everybody from left to right, through the centre, whether you opposed the last war or didn't, whether you have served your time in one or other of the political streams. None of that matters. We are determined to gather the largest and the broadest possible coalition in our own country and link up with other countries who say no to NATO, no to war. That's all. You know, if Tucker Carlson wants to showcase us, he's welcome. We don't care about his views on other matters. We are determined to stop what could be an existential war. A war which will lead to the extinction of life on this planet. And therefore, All other matters are secondary to that. There will be no world to argue about the political direction of. There will be no humans to try and persuade or to lead. And therefore, it's with great pleasure I say that this foundation of this organization, which was agreed in the previous session, though I will put the resolution again to you at the end of this one, has already been amply vindicated. On my way here this morning, our car was smashed by thieves who broke the rear screen and stole our things. Luckily, mainly, they got away with Indonesian food and my son's football gear. It was the least successful robbery in history. I'm not blaming NATO. Although thievery is a vital part of this story. I'm going to take for granted that you all know that this story did not begin a year ago. It didn't even begin in 2014 with the violent NATO-EU organized overthrow of the elected government and president of Ukraine. I know that you know all of that, or you wouldn't be here. I know that you know that actually NATO infiltration of and subjugation of Ukraine did not even begin in 2014. We know that because NATO have told us so. Stoltenberg, the tailor's dummy from Norway, who's never heard a shot fired in his life, in anger, told us that NATO has been active in Ukraine for at least 6 years, prior to 2014, never mind prior to the current war, 12 months old today. This is located in thievery. It is located in European thievery, far more grievous than any motor car robbers on the streets of Chiswick. The European colonial powers invaded and occupied and stole the wealth, even in the period of slavery, the people of the rest of the world. There has been no group of organized criminals ever in history like the European colonial powers. And this Orwell was quoted earlier in relation to 1984. Orwell's first novel, Burmese Days, in the form of the hero of the story, Jim Florey, he's asked by a girl whom he's chatting up, what's this imperialism you keep talking? What is imperialism? He said, well, I could give you a long answer or I can give you a short answer. Imperialism is going to other people's countries and stealing their things. And that is exactly what we have been doing. And why is that significant in this context? Because this is the moment where centuries of the colonialists' club, later joined and now ruled by the United States of America, this is the period when imperialism and its ability to roam around the world, invading other people's country and stealing their things, this is the day that it ends. This is the period that it ends. Not because of what's happening in Ukraine, but because of the volcanic, tectonic shift that it has provoked in the world. It has accelerated, perhaps by a decade, maybe 2 decades, the rise of a genuinely multipolar world, where the countries that were once colonies, I saw an African leader on television yesterday, I think he was the Ugandan leader, saying the colonists came and stole our things and our people, but we forgave them. But now the colonists demand that we accept their enemies as our enemies. Their enemies are their enemies, and our friends are our friends. And you can clear off if you think you can dictate to us with whom we have relations, whom we sanction, with whom we must be in a state of belligerence. And that point is sharpened to the most extreme in relation to China. The Pentagon issued a warning to China 3 days ago, before President Xi's peace proposals, when they didn't know what was in the peace proposals. There will be consequences for China should it decide to deepen its relations with Russia. Think of the arrogance, first of all, of that. We'll come to the stupidity. But think of the arrogance of one superpower threatening a second superpower with consequences were it to decide to have more friendly relations with a third party. The sense of exceptionalism you must feel to think you're entitled to do that, to think you're entitled to warn other countries who they can be friends with. But let's turn to the stupidity of it. You know, from Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger onwards, it was the policy of the United States to keep Russia and China as far apart as it was possible to keep them, and if possible, to keep them at each other's throats. In the last few years, the policy of the United States and NATO has made Russia and China virtually one country, certainly militarily and economically one country. And now they think China is going to obey orders from somebody called Antony Blinken. The days when China could be ordered around by foreigners is over. Ditto South Africa. South Africa was warned, why are you having joint naval exercises with the Russian and Chinese navies? As the leadership in South Africa pointed out, when you Western colonialist countries were supporting the apartheid dictatorship in South Africa, the only countries that stood with us were Russia and China. And you want us to consider them our enemies? I'm so old I was there. Every dinner that the African National Congress fighters ate in the bush came from Russia. Every uniform they had, every gun that they carried, every international initiative, campaign that they were able to mount to bring about the freedom of South Africa came from the then Soviet Union and from China. And now you want South Africa to be an enemy of Russia and China? Are you crazy? And South Africa has said no. India has said no. Iran has said no. Latin America, from north to south, has said no. Asia has said no. The Arab worlds, even the Saudis and the kings and the sheikhs in the desert have said no. The world is not against Russia and China. Don't imagine you speak for the world. The West, if you include it in it, countries that are very definitely not in the West. The last time I looked at the globe, Australia is not in the West. New Zealand is not in the West. But even if you allow them to call themselves the West, is 13% of the people of the world. 13% of the world's population lives in what could loosely be described as the West. And we are here to say, even in the West, there are millions and millions and millions of us who reject your domination and your wars and your clubs. Because, as a young woman pointed out, I don't know if she's in the second session, in the first session, from Iran, she said, when I was growing up, I thought that the colonialists had overthrown our government of Mossadegh in 1953 to grab our wealth, to make life better for you. And then I came here and I realized none of it is to make life better for you. These thieves are not stealing other people's things to give them to you. They're stealing other people's things to keep them for themselves, and that has got to end. And so it is with great pleasure that I welcome you here today. The first speaker is a good friend of mine that I first spotted as a young student. I spotted her skill, her intellect, her determination many years ago now, though she still looks as young as she did then. She was then a student. Now she is the coordinator of No Cold War, which is a part of this coalition that we are building here today. Please welcome Fiona Edwards.
Can you hear me? Just checking the mics are right. Thanks very much for that introduction, George. First of all, I really want to congratulate and thank the organisers of today's meeting with such determination to get this together despite all the intimidation and threats and the attempt to cancel this meeting twice. So just a round of applause for the organisers. It's absolutely vital that we are standing our ground and taking a stand today, because there really could hardly be a more important task for people like us who live within NATO countries to stand up and speak out against this aggressive military alliance which has caused such great human suffering, death and destruction in Afghanistan, in Libya and in Ukraine today. The Western governments and the Western mainstream media want to smear us, they want to ridicule us, and they ultimately want to silence us. They do not want an alternative opinion to their pro-NATO, pro-war narrative. But we really cannot allow ourselves to be cowed. We have to raise our voices and say no to NATO, no to war, and yes to peace. Today, we meet in London today, the heart of British imperialism. And as we know, Britain has been a key partner of the United States in its brutal wars in the Middle East and North Africa, which have killed and displaced millions of people. So much for human rights. What utter hypocrisy that they say they support human rights. Today, Britain once again is following the lead of Washington, moving on from the devastating war on terror, so-called war on terror, to play a leading and hawkish role in the new Cold War, which explicitly aims to stop the peaceful rise of China and preserve US global domination. This new Cold War is destabilizing the entire world. And as George said, there's actually a majority across the world that are against this because it's increasing instability, it's increasing threats to peace, and it's making people a lot worse off. And it has already brought a devastating hot war to Europe in Ukraine. And we really have to be clear about the following. You're not going to read this in the mainstream media. The opposite is what you'll hear. But the greatest threat facing us today, the greatest threat to humanity, is the warmongers in Washington and their lackeys in Britain and other NATO countries. We are living through perilous times. The US is simultaneously escalating a proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, and at the same time increasing aggression against China with an enormous military build-up in the Pacific. And it's vital that we play our part in building an international movement against these massive threats to humanity. So just on the war in Ukraine, this is a tragedy. This has caused tremendous human suffering, and finding a political solution to end the conflict through negotiations is absolutely vital. If we're going to find a political solution, it's crucial to understand what caused this war. It's decades of NATO expansion, bringing an aggressive military alliance right up to Russia's border, that has caused this war. US interference, including a coup in 2014, which installed a pro-NATO regime in Ukraine, has caused this war. The 8-year civil war following the US coup, which saw NATO powers arm Kiev and Ukrainian fascists in order to carry out attacks on the Russian-speaking population in the east of Ukraine, has caused this war. And having caused this war, you're not allowed to say that in the media, that's banned. They've caused this war, and instead of pushing for negotiations and a political solution, which is what is urgently needed to achieve a lasting peace, the United States, Britain and Europe are escalating this proxy war. They are pouring billions of dollars, euros and pounds